Hi guys. Today we're going to talk about line and shape. So, how do we as a director embed line and shape in the images that we're going to show on the film that we are creating? Lines are everywhere. In the real world, for example, doorways have two vertical lines, a volleyball has two curved lines. The real world is full of shapes. A door is a rectangle and a volleyball is a sphere. Lines and shapes are closely linked because they define each other. Now, lines differ from other visual components because lines appear only due to tonal and color contrast. Depending on this contrast, a line can be revealed or obscured. Lines exist in an infinite number of ways in the real world and in the screen world as well. To make recognizing them easier, lines can be divided into 7 perceptual types. These are edge, contour, closure, intersection of planes, imitation through distance, axis, and track. So this lecture will focus on these perceptual types and what ideas can you communicate using them. Also, you must realize that as directors, as filmmakers, we create films not only by in script, but as directors, we also embed visual images to also communicate an idea, not just through the script or through the dialogue, but also through the images that we present. Now, the first that we're going to talk about is the edge. The edge is defined as the apparent line around the borders of any two-dimensional object. Okay? These 4 lines are a drawing of a piece of paper. Obviously, a piece of paper is not truly not, but for our purpose, it can be considered as two-dimensional, as you are seeing in front of you. Now, when you look at this drawing of 4 lines, your image or you imagine a piece of paper. Examine a real piece of paper like this, for example, a book page. There aren't actually any lines around the page, but the edges of the pages are similar to lines. Okay? We accept this drawing of 4 lines as a representation of the edge of the page. But actually, a piece of paper or any two-dimensional object doesn't have any lines at all. They have edges. Now, lines will appear only if the tonal or color contrast is very apparent. A piece of white paper on a black background is easily seen, like on the image on the left. When the same paper is placed on a white background, then the paper and the lines practically disappears. Without tonal contrast, lines do not exist. A shadow cast into a two-dimensional wall is an example of edge. We see an edge or line around two-dimensional shadows even though there's no actual line there at all. So it's actually just a reflection of light and how light is interpreted or how light is reflected through the objects around the subject. As you can see in the photo in front of you, you see straight vertical lines because the shadow or the light source creates a shadow of those images. And those subtle details can actually communicate something if you use it or if it's very apparent in the images that you show in the films that you're going to do. Next will be contour. The apparent line around the border of any three-dimensional object is called contour. Most objects in the real world are three-dimensional, having height, width, and depth. And we perceive a line around these objects. So again, it's just a perception. There's not really, there are no lines on these three-dimensional object, but if we look at them, we manage to perceive lines depending on the angle that we look at a certain object. So, in this example, in this image, for example, a basketball is a three-dimensional object like what we've seen earlier. We accept the curved lines around the ball as the border of the ball itself. But a real ball doesn't have a line around it. Our perception creates the line. So, as you can see, so what you can see in front of you is a circle. Okay, so those are, if you're going to imagine, let's say, a ball, then you see the perceived line around it. Okay, but if you look at the ball, or if you pick up the ball and look at it closely, you can see that there are no lines in it. If the ball and the background are the same tone, as you see in the image in front of you, the lines and the ball will somewhat disappear because lines need tonal contrast to be seen. Next will be closure. The primary points of interest in a picture create imaginary lines. This is a drawing of 4 dots on your left, but a viewer imagines that those 4 dots can create a square on your right. So, in a way, our eyes and our brain actually perceive or actually imagine a square even though we just see 4 dots. So, in a way, our brain automatically connects the dots. Now, the viewer connects the dots or the primary points in the picture to produce lines. The primary points can be important objects, colors, tones, or anything that attracts the viewer's attention. The dots can connect to form any variety of curved or straight lines, triangles, squares, or any other shape. It depends on the intention of the director that put those points there. So, of course, you can, as a person who creates the film, so if you have the control to put in images there to suggest closure or to suggest movement or to suggest lines. Here, the primary points are the people's heads. The closure creates a triangle on the upper image and a diagonal line in a lower image. So, the lines are not really there, okay? But because of the points it represents, then we can create something or we can create shapes or lines depending on how we place it. Also, for intersection of planes, when 2 dimensions or when 2 planes meet or intersect, they appear to create a line. So in this example, imagine this as a wall. So the intersection of a wall can create an imaginary line. So to make it clearer, every corner of every room can create a line if there is tonal contrast between the 2 planes. In this image, for example, you can see there are a lot of vertical lines that represent the intersections of the wall. You can also see horizontal lines above the subject, and it creates a sort of box or a sort of square in a series of squares in the image. So this particular example can communicate something depending on the intention of the filmmaker. Okay, to make it more precise, if the tonal range is changed to remove the contrast between the two walls or planes, the lines disappear. So again, this is an example. So tonal range is important. The lines disappear as the tonal contrast is exaggerated, the lines become more apparent. So in image number 1 or in the upper image, you can see that the tonal contrast actually is on the lighter side. So the suggestions of the lines, okay, on the first image or the image above is not really very apparent. Comparing it to the image below, where tonal contrast is much more exaggerated. So you can see that the lines are more pronounced. So now we have imitation through distance. Imitation through distance, of course, when an object appears to reduce itself to a line or lines because it's so far away. Now, the grinders of this tower are not lines. They are large steel beams. Yet, at a distance, they look like lines. So, for both upper and lower images. Okay? The same is true for the telephone poles below or the distant desert road. When viewed from a distance, the object appears thin enough to imitate a line. But it's not really a line, it's a road. Okay? So, again, the two images can suggest that there is distance, and because of that distance, the road in itself can create a pattern or a line. Then we have axis. Many objects have an invisible axis that runs through them, and this is perceived as a line. People, animal, and trees are examples of objects that have an axis. A standing person has a vertical axis, while a reclining person has a horizontal axis. Now, an axis, like most other types of lines, need contrast to be seen. The axis becomes difficult to define when the tonal contrast between the object and the background is reduced, as you see on the right side of the picture. Now, on the left side, you can see that there is more contrast, so you can imagine the line better. Now, this shot has two vertical axis lines. Okay? Because again, it suggests two subjects or two people standing. Now, not all objects have an axis. Okay? A square has no definite single axis, but a rectangle does, as you see in the front of you. Now, the next that we're going to talk about is track. Track is the path of a moving object. As any object moves, it will leave a track or line on its path. Now, there are two types of path. You have actual and you have virtual path. Now, for example, first, we have actual tracks. So when certain objects move, they actually leave a visible track or line behind them. Now, in this example, a skywriting plane leaves a line of smoke behind it as it flies and skiers moving down a snowy hillside. Or as it flies, and skiers move down a snowy hillside, you will produce a line in the snow with their skis. Now, the smoke and indentions in the snow aren't actually lines, of course. Their imitation through distance or contour create a track left behind by a moving object. Now, this particular actual or visible track, okay, can be purposely communicated again by the filmmaker, and it can communicate something if done correctly and intently. Now, for the next example, so the lines there are, I just drew the lines for example purposes, but most objects don't create an actual track or line when they move. But they do generate a virtual or invisible line. Now, a virtual track is a line we must imagine. Okay? So, for example, a flying bird or a moving car generates visual tracks. The lines left behind by the bird or the car exist only in the viewer's imagination. Since tracks deal with moving objects, we have to, the audience have to imagine those imaginary lines. Okay? So, again, with proper intention, you can use this for communication purposes or to put forward the idea that you want to put in your film visually. Next, we have linear motif. Any picture can be reduced to simple lines. This is called the linear motif. A picture's linear motif can be any combination of circular, straight, vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines. Again, any combination of circular, straight, vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines. Here's a picture and a high contrast version of it that simplifies the tonal range and reveals the linear motif. Now, the linear motif is found by emphasizing the tonal contrast of the picture. Now, if you emphasize or you put the contrast in extreme, the first image or the image above can be interpreted or can be seen as the images below. Again, if you put in extreme contrast. So what do you see with these contrasts? Okay? There are two ways to reduce a picture to simple tonal contrasts. Okay? And reveal the linear motif. Many cinematographers actually use a contrast viewing glass to light their shots and to check tonal contrasts. A tonal contrast or a contrast viewing glass is used like a monocle. But its glass is extremely dark, usually a dark brown or blue color. Now, looking through the viewing glass increases the picture's contrast and reveals the linear motif. Another way to do this, a more simple way to do this, is you just squint your eyes. Okay? Squinting increases a picture's contrast, reduces the details, and emphasizes the lines that create the linear motif. So again, these lines, the shapes, and the linear motifs can actually be controlled by the filmmaker. Okay? So again, in this example, you can see people or your subjects actually conversing together. But that's just not it. We can actually add more visual elements to it by putting it into a certain set. That's why production design is very important in a film, because it doesn't just put the actors in a particular location or place, but the images that you can perceive in that particular place can communicate something in return. Okay? Like, I'm going to give you a more clear example. Now, squint at this shot and the linear motif is diagonal. Okay? As you can see in the image below. It is essential when evaluating or defining the linear motif that you analyze the line on the two-dimensional screen, not the line in real life. Now, when you place a particular line in this image, for example, you see diagonal line. So, what does that diagonal line suggest? Okay? So, it suggests something. Diba? When you put diagonal lines in your screen, so it can communicate something of, let's say, a chaotic atmosphere. Or it can create somewhat of a confusing scene. Now, in this example, in the real world, the fountain in this picture has two round bowls, the upper and the lower. But when you look at the image below, the more contrasted image, the bowl's curved lines are not curved at all. It's actually a straight line. The diagram reveals that the lines of the fountain bowl are nearly straight. The only curves in this picture are the arches at the background. So, again, as a filmmaker, you can actually control that. Okay? So, now, when you realize that you can control every aspect of the lines, the shapes that you can put in your screen, then you can communicate further than the dialogue and the script. Then, you can become, in a way, this is controlling the mise-en-scene of the film or of the image that you're going to show. Now, I will show you a series of images and try to imagine the emotional feeling, okay, that the lines may suggest to you as an audience. Okay. So, the first one is a pattern of horizontal line may suggest width, distance, calmness, and stability. Now, let's say, for example, you see this particular picture or you you shoot this particular image and you want the, you want the actor to deliver a line that you want to suggest that the actor will deliver the lines calmly, and basically in a more peaceful manner. Then you can put horizontal lines on the background so that the scene will be reinforced by the images that are going to you are going to feed your audience. Next, for example, vertical lines are often communicate a sense of height. They can suggest strength and rigidity. Now, in this image, for example, so the image above suggests that it's like a panel interview. So if you look at the contrasted image below, you can see a series of vertical lines. Okay, so big vertical lines. So what does it suggest? Okay, so maybe in this particular sequence or in this particular scene, you can communicate. It's because it's not just a panel interview, but maybe the panel or the people, the three people sitting down, represents somewhat of an authority. Okay, so again, the background image reinforces that idea. Okay, so these are again subtle images that can actually reinforce, or that you can actually use to reinforce the scene that you are building or the scene that you are shooting. A diagonal line, for example. Okay, so diagonal lines convey a feeling of movement. Objects in a diagonal position are unstable because they are neither vertical nor horizontal. They are either about to fall or already in motion. Now, in this particular image, when you look at the lines, okay, when it's contrasted, you can see vertical lines. Okay? I'm sorry, you can see diagonal lines. Now, again, so if you want your action sequence, or in this particular instance, I am imagining like an action sequence. Now, you can use vertical lines to suggest a more dynamic sequence or a more dynamic action sequence rather than just putting, let's say, your subjects in horizontal atmosphere. Okay, you can be more dynamic to put in vertical lines. Okay, now lastly, a series of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines can suggest chaos, confusion, and disorder. Now, in this particular scene, when you look at it, you can imagine like a very intense, very chaotic scene that one particular subject is in, but when you look at the background, di ba, there are a lot of lines intersecting, there are a lot of lines involved in this particular scene. So again, it adds to the emotion of confusion, or it adds to the emotion of chaos in the scene. Now next we have directions. A direction refers to the angle of lines or tracks created by moving objects. In the following drawings below, the arrow indicates the direction of the track made by a moving object. There are 8 directions in which an object can move on screen. Okay? So, affinity of direction within the shot is created when 2 or more objects move in the same direction. Now, in this shot, for example, or in this image in front of you, okay, you can see that the cars are moving forward or moving in the direction of the arrow. So the arrows are just imaginary. Okay? Now, you can see, even without the arrows, you can see the direction of the cars in front of you because you have references. You have a lot of, or a number of cars that are moving in one particular direction. Okay? So, next we have quality. Okay? The quality of line refers to the linear, straight line, or curvilinear or curved line nature of lines. Now, lines 1 and 2 have affinity of quality of line because they are both nearly straight. So, lines 1 and 2. Now, lines 3 and 4 have a contrast because lines 1 and 4 have contrast because one is straight, number 1, and the other is curved. So, affinity when it's similar, contrast when it's different. Generally speaking, a straight line is associated with these characteristics: direct, aggressive, bland, honest, industrial, ordered, strong, unnatural, adult, and rigid when we talk about straight lines. Now, a curved line often is associated with these characteristics naman. Indirect, passive, pertaining to nature, childlike, romantic, soft, organic, safe, and flexible. Now, these characteristics of line can create a predictable stereotype and are only a general guide. Okay? Your own feelings about straight, curved lines will affect how you use them. So, again, in using lines, okay, the quality of lines, is it straight, is it curved, you can use that to communicate something. Okay? Now, the characteristics that I gave you is only a mere suggestion. Of course, you can interpret how you see a straight line or how you see a curved line depending on your intention, again, to put those images in front of your audience. Okay? Now, these pictures illustrate contrast or affinity of quality of line within the shot. The contrast of the straight and curved lines increases the overall visual intensity of a scene. The affinity of straight lines kept the visual intensity low, like the image on your left. Okay? Now, while the image on your right creates the opposite effects for curves. Now, curves are, again, more dynamic. Curves can be seen as more movement, while straight lines can be seen in terms of visual intensity as more calm. Okay, quality. This pair of shots illustrates affinity of line quality. All the lines in both shots are straight lines. Okay, so again, it creates a more subtle, a more subdued scene in terms of visual intensity. So it creates, even though the scene is a bit dramatic, okay, but because of the straight line, you can see that the drama is not really one that has full of intensity. It's more subtle, okay. Kumbaga, it's more pigil yung drama. It creates sort of tension kasi pinipigilan nila yung emotion nila because, di ba, when you look at the straight lines, you see that particular, the lines are supporting the scene that the director wants to create. Okay? Now, there are many ways to apply the principle of contrast and affinity to line, including thick, thin, continuous and broken, long and short, in focus or out of focus. Okay, these are important considerations in a drawing class, but it becomes more difficult for an audience to notice these aspects of line during a story filled with moving images and sound. Okay, so in a way, mas nagiging difficult siya ipakita if the object is moving for example in films. But if you can create that particular pattern and that consistency during the sequence, then it can create something of a very convincing image. It can be as subtle as the pictures or the images in front of you, but because of that intention of using these lines, now the images become artistry. Then the style becomes authorship. Now we're going to talk about shapes. Okay, now, just as there are basic types of spaces and lines, there are basic shapes as well. The basic shapes are circle, square, and the equilateral triangle. Now, the shape exists in a visual space that can be flat or deep. Therefore, shapes can be classified as two-dimensional for flat space and three-dimensional for deep space. Now, in the images in front of you, the circle, square, and triangle above are two-dimensional. Now, the sphere, the cube, and the three-sided pyramid are three-dimensional. See the difference between the two? But of course, it still suggests certain lines to it. Now, a shape can be classified as basic only if its unseen side can be predicted correctly. By examining the visual sides, now, three-sided pyramid reveals all the information needed about the shape of its hidden side. Now, the cube does the same. And of course, the sphere shape remains identical no matter how it's turned. But if you see the images in front of you, diba, a cylinder, for example, when you look at the bottom of it, is also a circle. Now, a cone, for example, if you look at the bottom of it, like the images below, now it's also a circle. In this particular angle, look at the images below. You don't really know, or you cannot really tell which is the cylinder or which is the cone. But if you look at different angles, then it can suggest. So that's the difference between two-dimensional images and three-dimensional images. Now, three-dimensional images can actually vary. The shape of the three-dimensional images can actually vary depending on the angle that you put the image on. Now, the real world is filled with millions of objects, and each one seems to have its own unique shape. Okay? Now, the basic shape of any object can be revealed by reducing it to silhouette. Okay? Any object, no matter how apparently unique, can be categorized into three basic shapes. Nga, the square, the triangle, and the equilateral triangle and the circle. Now, this for example, every object has a basic shape that can be discovered by reducing the object to its silhouette. Now, here are the basic shapes or the basic silhouettes of three cars. Okay? The first car on your left is based on a circle. So, a circle is the most benign of the basic shapes. It doesn't have an up or down or any size. A circle has no direction or intrinsic visual dynamic. So, bilog lang siya eh. Diba? It doesn't suggest movement. Okay? Most people describe cars with circular shape as friendly or cute. Now, in the middle, the vehicle is obviously based on a square or a rectangle shape. It is less friendly than the circular car, but it seems to possess visual stability and solidity that the circular car lacks. So when you see the image or the silhouette of the car on the middle, so it looks more stable than the silhouette of the car on the left, which suggests a circle. Now, the fastest of the three cars has the shape of the triangle. It may be a high-performance race car, but its basic shape is a triangle. The triangle is the most dynamic of the three basic shapes because it is the only shape that contains at least one diagonal line or at least one diagonal line. A triangle is an arrow, so to speak. It points in a particular direction, which is something the square and the circle cannot do. So in this particular instance, when you look at the three cars, and you ask which one is faster, automatically, because of its shape, you will say that the car on the rightmost side of the image or the race car. Even without seeing it in motion, because of the shape, it can suggest that particular meaning. So it doesn't work with cars. It does not only work with cars. Okay. Now, in this particular example, faces can be categorized as basic shapes as well. Okay, so square-jawed, circular face, or a bit of a triangle. So you can embed, for example, personalities based on these three. Okay, you can see that the square face looks more serious, diba? And when you look at the round-faced person or the round-faced character, now, the round-faced character may seem a bit more funny in terms of personality, a bit more energetic, comparing it to the stoic face of the square-jawed person. Now, the right-side person is a bit of a triangle. Now, it can create somewhat of a personality as well. So, it can create a multifaceted personality. Now, when you look at the person that has the triangle face, it can he or she can suggest, let's say, that he is more sinister or more conniving, diba? If you look at it, mas mukhang kontrabida, for example, yung triangle shaped person in terms of the shape of the face. Again, you can use that in your casting, or you can use that in creating or in casting the personalities of your subject. Okay. Also, you can use that in trees as well. Okay, furnitures and everything else can be classified into one of the three shapes that can easily be seen by looking at the object silhouette. Okay. So, the first two on your left can suggest circles. Okay. The next two can suggest triangles. And the last one can suggest a square. Now, lighting patterns and shadows can also produce circles, squares, and triangles. And again, it can create or it can communicate meaning. The three images in front of you suggests that there are three lighting styles that you can use. Now, the same emotional characteristics associated with curved and straight lines can be linked to round, square, and triangle shapes. Okay, now the rounded shapes are often described as indirect, passive, romantic, pertaining to soft, organic, childlike, safe, and flexible. Okay, so square shapes are direct, industrial, ordered, linear, unnatural, adult, and rigid. And because of their diagonal lines, triangles are often described as bold, aggressive, dynamic, angry, menacing, chaotic, disordering, and unorganized. Now, remember, all these emotional associations are not rules and can lead to stereotypes. So again, you have to use this judiciously. Okay? Intention. Kailangan may intention ka even with the lighting. For example, if you see the upper left image, so it's tawag dito, the lighting is a circle. So in a way, as you can see, it can create like a spotlight. Okay? It's more of, kumbaga, if you interpret, well, in my interpretation, so it's more of the person or the subject in the center is holding the scene together. Siya yung main subject ng scene. Of course, because you can see the face and you can see the lighting, the spotlight-ish lighting. Now, when you look at the upper right, the square lighting, diba, it can create more of just a conversation. So, parang nag-uusap lang yung tatlong subjects nyo. Although the person in the middle is still the main subject, but in a way, it can be seen as something that just the three friends conversing. Okay, now, when you look at the bottom image, a more triangle shape, a more diagonal shape of lighting, parang nagiging ano siya, it can suggest more of an interrogation. Okay? Now, you can see, just by adjusting the shape and the lines of the lighting, you can communicate or embed a more interesting meaning to the images that are placed in front of your audience. Okay? Now, remember, shape control requires careful examination of an object silhouette. Okay? So, again, this has to be intentional. The shapes that you're going to put in your image has to be intentional. Kailangan kontrolado siya ng director. Okay? It's not just that's the difference. That's what separate a director or a film student or a filmmaker from just a videographer. Of course, we respect both skills, but ito nga yung difference, di ba? How you place your image and how those subtle images, lines can communicate something. Di ba? Kasi if, let's say for example, a videographer, kukunan lang niya yung image, he's just going to shoot the image as it is. Okay? But, again, a filmmaker has an eye for detail. So, itong mga intrinsic shapes at itong mga subtle images, subtle lines that he can add into the image that he wants to show the audience, di ba, is more intentional. So, how do we do that? First, you have to evaluate the shapes. Okay? The shapes of the actors. If the actor and the wardrobe are reduced to silhouettes, what is the basic shape? Okay? The scenery, for example. The scenery, define the lines to discover the shape of your picture. So, is it horizontal? Diba? Is it vertical? Okay? These lines usually create squares and rectangles. Now, diagonal lines can create triangles. Again, you can manipulate this even with, if it's a straight line, diba? You can use your cameras to actually manipulate these lines. Okay? Next is set dressing. Define the basic shapes of furniture and other set dressing. Again, importante. It is very important yung production design. Okay? Next, you have to control the lighting. Now, lighting can change or emphasize the basic shapes of an object in the picture. A pattern of light can create a circular, a square, or a triangular shape. Okay? You can play with shadows, you can play with the light in itself. Now, third, you have to simplify. Shape works best if it's easy for the audience to see similarities and differences. Use lens choices and camera angles to emphasize or remove lines and shapes in the shot. Okay? You have to simplify. Okay? And you have to be consistent. Like for example, in one particular sequence, yung kagad yung iisipin nyo, you have to think about what is the mood that I want to convey, or what is the image or the idea that I want to communicate in this particular sequence. Okay, say for example, I want this particular sequence to be somewhat of subtle, peaceful way. Subtle and peaceful image. Kasi ang gusto ko, for example, is magkakaroon ng internal communication or soliloquy yung character mo. Kakausapin niya yung sarili niya. Okay? So, what do I do? Diba? Kung kakausapin niya yung sarili niya, the character or the subject must be in a place of calm. Kasi hindi mo kayang kausapin yung sarili mo, or you cannot communicate with yourself with a lot of noise in the background or with a lot of dynamic images. Okay? So what you can do is maybe, diba, you try to put your subject in a scenery where there are a lot of vertical shapes. A lot of horizontal shapes. Now, if you want, let's say for example, the character, you want the audience to see that the character is confused, is angry, and has a lot of mixed emotions. Diba? When you can place the character, say, on an image that there are a lot of intersecting lines at the background and diagonal and straight lines, and you can create a more chaotic. So the images that the audience can see on the background can reflect to the state of mind of the character. Okay? So those are the things, and just a few of the things that you can do or you can manipulate, okay, to make your images or to make your films better. Okay? And again, as directors, okay, you have the right and you have the power to do such things. Okay. In that note, that ends my lecture about line and shape. I hope you learned something in the process. Okay? So thank you very much for watching, and keep safe. Now, always remember to check your BBL for updates and announcements. Again, thank you very much, and keep safe. See you in my next video.